For 40 years, Margaret Lawson believed her husband was just a quiet man who loved his workshop more than words. But the day she opened a hidden ledger he never meant her to find, she uncovered coordinates, coded entries, and one chilling phrase repeated over decades. Check bunker integrity. What she thought was a lifetime of ordinary love began to unravel into something far darker and far more deliberate than she could have imagined. At 74, standing alone in the dim light of her late husband's workshop, Maggie ran her fingers over the worn leather cover of the ledger, her pulse unsteady, her breath shallow, as if even touching it meant crossing a line she could never uncross. Thomas Lawson had been gone for just 9 days, and already the house felt like it was forgetting him. His boots still by the door, his coat still hanging where he left it, his scent fading from the air like a memory slipping through her grasp. But nothing about this felt like something meant to be forgotten. Tom had always been a man of routine, the kind who woke at the same hour, drank his coffee black, and disappeared into his workshop for hours at a time, emerging with sawdust on his sleeves and quiet satisfaction in his eyes, offering simple explanations when she asked what he'd been working on, never elaborate, never suspicious, just enough to satisfy a question and move on. Maggie had trusted that rhythm. She had trusted him. 40 years of marriage teaches you not to question the silences too closely, especially when they're wrapped in consistency, in dependability, in the comfort of knowing someone will be there at the end of the day. But now, flipping through the brittle pages of the ledger, that comfort began to fracture. The entries weren't like anything she had expected. No financial accounts, no woodworking plans, nothing that resembled the life he had shown her. Instead, there were coordinates written in careful precision, dates spanning decades, and short notes that felt more like reminders than explanations. Some entries were just numbers. Others had single words: secure, revisit, intact. And then there was the phrase, again and again, scattered across pages separated by years. Check bunker integrity. Maggie frowned, her mind struggling to make sense of it. Bunker? The word didn't belong in their life. Tom hadn't been in the military. He hadn't been the type to prepare for disasters or stockpile supplies. He barely tolerated camping trips, always complaining about the cold, the damp, the discomfort. The idea that he had maintained something called a bunker for decades felt absurd, until she noticed the dates weren't old memories. They were recent. The last entry had been written just 6 months before his death, the ink slightly faded but unmistakably newer than the rest. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the ledger, the weight of it settling into her palms like something alive, something waiting. For the first time since the funeral, grief gave way to something else. Unease, sharp and insistent, threading through her chest. What else had he not told her? The question lingered longer than she wanted it to. Maggie set the ledger down on the workbench and looked around the workshop as if seeing it for the first time. It had always been his space, a place she respected but rarely entered without reason. Tools lined the walls in perfect order, each one cleaned, maintained, and returned to its place with quiet discipline. Shelves held jars of screws, nails, and fittings sorted with meticulous care. Nothing about it suggested secrecy until now. Now, every corner felt like it might be hiding something. Every drawer, every panel, every inch of wood carried the possibility that the man she loved had been living a second life just beyond her reach. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, opening drawers she had never touched before, running her hands along the surfaces, tapping lightly against the wood as if expecting something to echo back. It felt foolish at first, like she was chasing shadows, but the ledger had changed something fundamental. It had planted doubt where certainty once lived, and doubt has a way of making the ordinary feel unfamiliar. When her fingers brushed against the underside of the workbench, she paused. There, a slight irregularity. Not visible, not obvious, but enough to make her lean closer. She pressed gently, and a small section of wood shifted inward with a soft click. Maggie's breath caught. Slowly, she pulled the hidden panel open, revealing a narrow compartment she never knew existed. Inside, there was nothing elaborate, just a small metal box, dull and unremarkable, the kind you might overlook if you didn't know it was there. But she knew now. She lifted it out carefully, her hands steadier than she expected, and set it on the bench. For a moment, she hesitated. Opening it felt like a decision she couldn't undo, a line between the life she thought she had and the one she was about to uncover. But the ledger had already crossed that line for her. She opened the box. Inside were folded papers, yellowed with age, and a photograph. Maggie picked up the photograph first. It showed Tom, much younger, maybe in his 30s, standing beside 3 other men she didn't recognize. They weren't smiling. They weren't relaxed. They stood rigid, serious, in front of a structure that didn't look like anything she had ever seen him near. It wasn't a workshop. It wasn't a home. It looked industrial, isolated, almost restricted. Her stomach tightened. Beneath the photograph were the papers, maps, printed coordinates, and a more detailed version of what she had seen in the ledger. Lines drawn across terrain, markings that seemed deliberate, purposeful. And at the center of one map, circled in red, was a location. The same location repeated in the ledger. The same place tied to that one word, bunker. Maggie sank into the chair beside the workbench, the reality settling over her slowly but completely. This wasn't a forgotten hobby. This wasn't a harmless secret. This was something he had maintained for decades, something he had hidden with precision and care, something he had never once trusted her with. 40 years. 40 years of shared life, shared memories, shared everything. And yet this had remained buried, just like whatever lay at the end of those coordinates. She looked down at the map again, tracing the lines with her finger, her hesitation fading into something sharper, something more determined. If Tom had gone to this much effort to hide it, then it had to matter. And if it mattered this much, if it had been worth 40 years of silence, then she needed to know why. Because whatever truth waited out there, hidden beneath layers of time and secrecy, was no longer just his. It was hers now. And for the first time since his death, Margaret Lawson felt something stronger than grief rising inside her. She felt resolve. The coordinates in Tom's ledger were never meant to be followed. But 3 days after finding them, Margaret Lawson stood at the edge of a narrow, overgrown forest road, gripping the steering wheel of her old Buick as if it were the only steady thing left in her world, wondering how a life she had trusted for 40 years had led her here, to a place her husband had hidden so carefully it barely seemed real. The drive had taken longer than expected, not because the distance was great, but because the roads gradually surrendered their structure the farther she went. Pavement turned to gravel, gravel thinned into dirt, and eventually even the dirt seemed like an afterthought, as though the land itself was trying to erase the path. Maggie had almost turned back twice, her instincts urging her to abandon the search, to return to the quiet safety of what she knew. But every time doubt crept in, she saw the ledger in her mind again. The repetition of that phrase, the precision of those entries, the quiet persistence of a man who had kept this secret alive for decades. It didn't feel optional anymore. It felt inevitable. When she finally parked, there was no sign to greet her, no marker to confirm she had arrived. Just trees, dense and tall, their branches knitting together to block out much of the afternoon light, and a silence so complete it seemed to press in on her ears. She stepped out of the car slowly, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes far louder than it should have been, and took a moment to steady herself. The air was cooler here, heavier somehow, carrying the scent of damp earth and old leaves. It didn't feel like a place people came to. It felt like a place they forgot. Maggie retrieved the folded map from her coat pocket, the paper soft from being handled too many times over the past few days, and studied it again, matching the lines and markings to the terrain in front of her. According to Tom's careful notes, the location wasn't directly on the road. It required walking, precise steps, measured distances, small directional shifts that only made sense if you trusted the person who wrote them. She hesitated only a second before stepping off the path and into the woods, the branches brushing against her coat as if resisting her presence. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from the terrain, but from the growing awareness that she was following a trail her husband had never intended her to find. The forest swallowed sound quickly. Even the faint noise of the road disappeared within minutes, leaving her alone with the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the occasional crack of twigs beneath her feet. She counted her steps as the ledger instructed, her voice barely above a whisper as she kept track, turning when the map told her to turn, adjusting her direction when the terrain forced her to deviate slightly. It felt absurd at times, like she was playing a game she didn't understand, But the deeper she went, the more certain she became that this wasn't guesswork. Tom had mapped this place with intention. He had walked this path himself, again and again, checking, recording, maintaining. The thought sent a chill through her. How many times had he come out here while she believed he was somewhere else? How many quiet weekends? How many late afternoons? How many simple explanations had concealed something far more deliberate? The questions lingered as she moved forward, but they didn't slow her down. If anything, they pushed her further. When she reached what she believed was the final set of coordinates, she stopped, turning slowly in a full circle, scanning the area for anything that didn't belong. At first, there was nothing. Just more trees, more uneven ground, more silence. "This is it," she murmured, frustration creeping into her voice. It didn't make sense. The ledger had been too precise for this to be nothing. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes searching the ground more carefully now, looking for subtle differences rather than obvious signs. That's when she noticed it. A slight rise in the earth, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it, covered in thicker brush than the surrounding area, as if nature had been encouraged to reclaim it. Maggie approached slowly, her heart beginning to pound, each step deliberate. She crouched down, brushing aside leaves and twigs, her fingers digging into the soil just enough to feel beneath the surface. Something solid. Not stone, not roots. Metal. Her breath caught as she cleared more debris, revealing the edge of a steel hatch, its surface weathered but unmistakably man-made. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the reality of what she had found settling over her in waves. This wasn't theory anymore. This wasn't suspicion. This was proof. Tom had built, or at least maintained, something here. Something he had never told her about. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the hatch and pulled. It resisted at first, the hinges stiff from years of exposure, but with a stronger effort, it gave way, opening with a low, groaning sound that seemed to echo through the trees. Beneath it, a narrow metal ladder descended into darkness, the air rising from below cool and stale, carrying a faint scent of rust and something older she couldn't quite place. Maggie hesitated at the edge, looking down into the blackness, her mind racing. This was the moment where she could still turn back, still close the hatch and walk away, still choose not to know. But that choice had been slipping away since the moment she opened the ledger. Taking a steady breath, she reached into her bag, pulled out the flashlight she had brought, and switched it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness below. Then, slowly, carefully, she began to descend. The ladder creaked under her weight, each step echoing faintly as she moved down, the light revealing more of the space with every inch. When her feet finally touched solid ground, she turned slowly, sweeping the beam across the interior, and felt the world shift beneath her. The bunker was larger than she expected, not cavernous but carefully constructed, with reinforced walls and a low ceiling that made the space feel both contained and deliberate. Shelves lined one side, holding containers and boxes labeled in a handwriting she knew instantly. Tom's. A small workbench stood against the far wall, tools arranged with the same meticulous care she had seen in his workshop at home. But it wasn't the structure that unsettled her. It was what filled it. Papers. Dozens of them. Stacks organized into neat piles, each one bound or clipped together, labeled with dates and short notations. And beside them, more ledgers, thicker than the one she had found, their spines worn from use. Maggie stepped forward slowly, her flashlight trembling slightly as she set it down on the workbench to free her hands. She picked up one of the ledgers and opened it, her eyes scanning the pages quickly at first, then slowing as the content registered. Names. List of them. Dates beside each entry. Notes written in shorthand, some crossed out, others circled. It didn't look like anything she recognized from his life. It looked official, or at least organized in a way that suggested purpose beyond a hobby. She reached for another, flipping through it more carefully, her breath catching when she saw photographs tucked between the pages. She pulled one free. It showed a group of men standing beside a large vehicle, the kind used for transport, not personal travel. Tom was there, again younger, again serious, again in a place she had never seen him. Her hands shook as she set it down and reached for another photo. Different location, different people, same expression on his face. Focused, controlled. A man she didn't fully recognize. The realization settled over her slowly but completely. The man she had spent 40 years with had lived a life she had never been part of. And this place, this hidden bunker buried deep in the forest, wasn't just a secret. It was a record of that life. A life he had kept. Separate. A life he had protected. And now, standing alone in the dim light of the space he had built to hide it, Maggie understood something with chilling clarity. Whatever Tom had been involved in, it hadn't ended when he came home. It had followed him. It had stayed with him. And now, it had been left to her. What Margaret Lawson didn't yet realize, standing alone in that bunker surrounded by 40 years of secrets, was that she wasn't the only one who knew it existed. And by the time she read her husband's final entry, it would already be too late to pretend this was just a mystery she could quietly walk away from. The third day she returned to the bunker. She came prepared, not just with food and water, but with a kind of quiet determination that had replaced the initial shock. Her movements steadier now as she climbed down the ladder, her flashlight beam cutting through the dimness like she belonged there. The air no longer felt foreign. It felt claimed by Tom, and now, in some strange and irreversible way, by her. She set her things down on the workbench and went straight to the ledgers, no longer hesitating before opening them, no longer skimming but reading, carefully, methodically, as if piecing together a life that had been deliberately scattered across decades. Patterns began to emerge. Names that repeated, dates that aligned with times Tom had supposedly been out of town for work, locations that matched the photographs. And beneath it all, a structure, an operation, quiet and concealed, operating in the margins of legitimacy. Transport logs, coded references to deliveries, not of goods she could identify, but of units, assets, packages. The language was deliberately vague, but the consistency made it clear this was no hobby. This was work. Organized, long-term, and carefully hidden. Maggie felt a tightening in her chest as she read, not just from fear, but from something more complicated, betrayal mixed with a reluctant understanding. Tom hadn't just kept a secret. He had built a second life and maintained it with discipline that bordered on obsession. And yet, scattered between the clinical entries, there were moments where the mask slipped. Small notes written in a different tone. Short sentences that didn't belong in a ledger. Too close. They're watching. Can't trust the new ones. And once, written in a way that looked almost rushed. If anything happens, the bunker stays. That line stayed with her as she moved deeper into the records, her fingers brushing against a thinner notebook tucked beneath the others. It was different, less worn, more recent. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting immediately. Tom's, but shakier, less controlled. The entries here weren't coded. They were direct, personal. The first page made her sit down. Maggie never asked. I always told myself that made it easier, that I was protecting her. Truth is, I didn't want to see what would happen if she knew. Her vision blurred slightly as she read, her grip tightening on the edges of the page. She turned to the next entry. The bunker isn't for survival. It never was. It's leverage. It's insurance. Names, records, proof of things that don't officially exist anymore. I kept it because I couldn't risk destroying it. Too many people tied to it. Too many loose ends. Maggie swallowed hard, her heart pounding now, the weight of his words pressing down on her. This wasn't just about secrecy. This was about power. Dangerous, hidden power that had been sitting beneath the ground for decades. She flipped further, her hands moving faster now despite the growing tension in her chest, until she reached the final entry. The ink was uneven, the lines less steady, as if written by someone who knew time was running out. If you're reading this, I didn't tell you. I ran out of time, or courage, or both. I wanted to believe I could leave this buried and it would stay that way. But things have changed. People are asking questions again. Old names coming back. If they come to you, they won't explain. They'll take. Don't give them anything. Not the ledgers. Not the location. Nothing. Maggie's breath hitched as she read the last lines, the words cutting deeper than anything else she had found. You'll think. You don't understand any of this. You will. You always understood more than I gave you credit for. That's why I'm leaving it to you. Not the secret, the choice. The page ended there. No signature. No explanation. Just silence. Maggie sat there for a long time, the quiet of the bunker wrapping around her as everything settled into place. 40 years of lies, but not meaningless ones, not careless ones. Tom hadn't hidden this because he didn't trust her. He had hidden it because he knew exactly what it was and what it could do. The realization shifted something inside her. She wasn't just a widow uncovering a secret. She was the only person left who knew it existed, and the only one standing between it and whoever else might come looking. That thought followed her all the way back up the ladder, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the world above had changed while she was below. When she stepped out into the late afternoon light, the forest felt different. Not quieter, but watchful. She closed the hatch carefully, covering it again with debris, her hands moving with a precision she didn't know she had. By the time she reached her car, the sun was already dipping lower, shadows stretching across the narrow road. And that's when she saw him. He wasn't standing close, just far enough to seem casual, leaning slightly against a dark sedan parked a short distance behind hers. Well-dressed. Still. Waiting. Maggie stopped, her instincts sharpening instantly, every word from Tom's final entry echoing in her mind. If they come to you, they won't explain. They'll take. The man pushed himself off the car slowly as she approached, his expression calm, almost polite, as if this were a chance encounter instead of something far more intentional. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice smooth, measured. Not a question, a certainty. Maggie didn't answer right away. She studied him the way she had studied the ledgers, carefully, looking for what wasn't being said. "We've been trying to reach you," he continued, adjusting his jacket slightly. "Your husband left behind some materials that are sensitive. We'd like to resolve that quietly." There it was. No details. No explanation. Just the assumption that she would hand everything over without question. Maggie felt something steady settle in her chest, something that hadn't been there before. Clarity. For 40 years, she had been the one kept in the dark, the one protected, the one who didn't ask too many questions. But that version of her no longer fit the moment she was standing in. She took a step closer, her posture straightening, her gaze unwavering as she met his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said evenly. The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you do." A pause stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Maggie could feel the weight of the bunker behind her, hidden beneath layers of earth and secrecy, the ledgers, the names, the proof of everything Tom had spent decades preserving. She thought of his final words. Not the secret, the choice. And in that moment, she made hers. She returned his faint smile, calm and unshaken. "Then I think you're mistaken," she replied, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. The man held her gaze for a second longer, as if reassessing, recalculating, before giving a small nod. "We'll be in touch," he said quietly, turning back toward his car. Maggie watched him leave, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, and only then did she allow herself to exhale fully. This wasn't over. She knew that now. Whatever Tom had been part of, whatever he had kept hidden, it hadn't ended with him. It had simply changed hands. And as Maggie Lawson stood alone on that quiet road, the last light of day fading around her, she understood the truth her husband had spent 40 years carrying. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. They're meant to be held by the one person strong enough to decide what happens next. And now, for better or worse, that person was her.